Whatever happens in there, just keep calling me Claire. Claire Bennett said it quietly, but the way her fingers tightened around Ethan Walker's hand made him glance at her twice. It was 6:42 on Friday evening, and they were standing beneath the stone entrance of Bennett Ridge Resort, a sprawling mountain retreat outside Asheville, where warm lights glowed against the Blue Ridge twilight and cars worth more than Ethan's house rolled toward the valet stand. Ethan looked down at his faded navy jacket, then at his 8-year-old daughter Sophie, who was busy counting the fireplaces she could see through the lobby windows. Claire, I'm pretending to be your date for one weekend, not testifying before Congress. For half a second, she almost laughed. You haven't met my family. Ethan smiled. I've survived 8 years of parent-teacher conferences. I'll take my chances. What Ethan didn't know was that Claire hadn't brought him to someone else's luxury resort. Her name was on the company that owned it. By Monday morning, more than 4,000 employees would call her chief executive officer. And before this weekend ended, Ethan would discover that the woman beside him had hidden far more than her job title. A young valet hurried forward as Claire approached. Recognition flashed across his face. Good evening, Ms. Ben. Claire gave him a look so quick Ethan missed it. Claire, she said. Just Claire this weekend. The valet recovered immediately. Of course, ma'am. Ethan handed him the keys to his 12-year-old Ford pickup. She pulls a little to the right, and the passenger window needs encouragement. The valet stared at the truck, then at Claire, as though neither belonged in the same photograph. Sophie leaned toward him. You have to press the button twice. Sophie, Ethan murmured. I'm helping. Claire covered a smile. They crossed the lobby beneath a chandelier, suspended 3 stories above polished stone. Employees seemed to straighten whenever Claire passed. A manager near the front desk actually stepped forward, then stopped when Claire gave the smallest shake of her head. Ethan noticed that one. You come here often? A few times. They seem to know you. Claire looked toward the windows. Hospitality is a small world. It wasn't technically a lie, and somehow that made the guilt worse. Ethan had agreed to this because she said she needed help surviving a family weekend without being paired off with another ambitious stranger. He had asked almost nothing in return. No money, no favors, no introductions. He had only made one thing clear before saying yes. I don't do games around my daughter. Claire had promised there wouldn't be any. Now Sophie slipped her small hand into Claire's free one as naturally as if she'd done it 100 times. Claire looked down, startled. You look nervous, Sophie said. I am. Dad gets nervous too. He just gets quieter. Ethan sighed. Thank you for protecting my reputation. Sophie grinned. Claire didn't. She was watching Ethan with an expression he couldn't read. Then the revolving doors turned behind them. A silver-haired man in a tailored charcoal suit entered, saw Claire, and immediately changed direction. Claire went still. Claire Bennett, he called. I've been trying to reach you since the board landed. Ethan turned toward her. Bored? The man's gaze moved from Claire to Ethan, then to Sophie, and surprise slowly replaced recognition. Well, he said, extending his hand to Ethan. This is unexpected. Claire stepped between them half a second too late. The man studied Ethan's worn jacket, his calloused hand, and the old pickup disappearing toward the parking lot. Then he looked back at Claire, suddenly understanding something Ethan did not. His expression changed. Mr. Walker, he said carefully, do you have any idea who you're here with? 6 days earlier, Ethan Walker had been standing behind the counter of a small coffee shop in West Asheville, trying to convince Sophie that whipped cream did not qualify as breakfast when Claire Bennett walked through the door looking like someone who had forgotten how ordinary mornings worked. No tailored suit, no assistant, no waiting car. She wore jeans, a cream sweater, and carried a leather purse that Ethan noticed only because the strap snapped as she reached for her coffee. Her phone, keys, and wallet scattered across the floor. Ethan crouched to help before she could react. That bag just submitted its resignation. Claire stared at him, then laughed, unexpectedly and without restraint. It was the first genuine laugh she had managed all week. Ethan gathered her things while Sophie rescued a silver pen that had rolled beneath a chair. Claire offered him $20 for helping. He looked at the bill, then at her. You are paying me for picking up your keys. For your trouble. My trouble lasted 12 seconds. He handed the money back. Claire was accustomed to people accepting whatever she offered. Ethan simply returned to his coffee. 10 minutes later, they met again outside when Claire discovered that her rental car would not start. Ethan knew enough about engines to identify a loose battery connection, and 5 minutes with a small toolkit behind his truck seat solved the problem. Again, she offered money. Again, he refused. At least let me buy your coffee. You already tried paying me $20 for gravity. Sophie laughed so hard she nearly spilled her hot chocolate. Claire looked at the girl, then at Ethan, and something in her expression softened. They ended up sharing a table while Sophie finished a school worksheet. Claire said she worked in hospitality. Ethan said he built custom furniture and managed a small woodworking shop. Neither sounded impressed by the other's occupation, which Claire found strangely refreshing. She asked about Sophie. Ethan answered easily. She asked about Sophie's mother. That answer came more slowly. Rachel died 4 years ago. Claire lowered her eyes. I am sorry. Ethan nodded once. He had learned that sympathy was easiest to accept when people did not decorate it with questions. Claire understood the silence and changed the subject. That was the first thing about her Ethan remembered later. She knew when not to push. They spoke for another 20 minutes before Claire finally admitted she had a problem. Her family was gathering at a mountain resort that weekend, and her mother had invited a man Claire had been avoiding for months. So, you need an escape route? Ethan asked. I need evidence. Evidence of what? That I am unavailable. Ethan stared at her. Claire took a careful breath. Come with me for the weekend. As my date. Ethan almost laughed. She did not. You are serious. Unfortunately. Claire, we met 30 minutes ago, which means you have not had enough time to disappoint my family yet. Sophie looked up from her worksheet. Dad, she is funny. That is not helping. Ethan refused anyway. Claire thanked him, gave Sophie a warm goodbye, and left without pressing. That should have ended it. But Sunday afternoon, Sophie found the business card Claire had accidentally left beneath her worksheet. There was only a name and phone number on the side, facing up. She seemed lonely, Sophie said. Ethan looked at his daughter. Children sometimes noticed what adults worked very hard to hide. Monday morning, he called Claire. He agreed to one weekend under 3 conditions. Sophie came with him. Nobody used Sophie as part of the act, and nobody lied. There was silence on the line. 3 full seconds. Then Claire said, agreed. Less than an hour later, her phone rang inside a private office Ethan had never seen. Claire answered, and a man's urgent voice said, the board moved the emergency meeting to Saturday morning. Miss Bennett. They expect the chief executive officer in the conference room at 9. Claire closed her eyes. Ethan had just agreed to spend a weekend with her because she promised there would be no lies, and she had already failed to tell him the one truth that could change everything. By Friday evening, Ethan had learned that Claire Bennett was very good at answering questions without quite answering them. The silver-haired man in the lobby held out his hand, waiting for Ethan to respond, but Claire stepped closer with a calm smile that did not reach her eyes. Martin, Ethan is here with me for the weekend. That is all he needs to know tonight. Martin studied her for a moment, then understood the warning. Of course. He shook Ethan's hand. Martin Caldwell, old family friend. Ethan Walker. Martin glanced toward Sophie. And you must be Sophie. Sophie nodded politely, but her eyes followed Martin as he walked away. He talks like a principal, she whispered. Ethan smiled. Claire did not. At the front desk, another strange thing happened. Ethan reached for his wallet, but the clerk said their accommodations had already been handled. Family reservation, Claire explained. Upstairs, Ethan discovered that his room was larger than his entire woodworking shop office, with a stone fireplace. 2 bedrooms and windows overlooking miles of darkening mountains. He stepped back into the hallway and found Claire waiting. This is your family's idea of a casual weekend? My family has trouble with casual. I noticed. Sophie ran past them toward the window. Dad, there are robes. Ethan looked at Claire. We have officially entered dangerous territory. This time she laughed, and for a few seconds the tension disappeared. Before dinner, they reviewed the rules. They would not pretend when nobody else was watching. Sophie would never be used to make the relationship seem more convincing. Personal questions could be declined without explanation. Ethan added one more. No lying. Claire's smile faded almost invisibly. No lying, she repeated. Ethan did not notice the pause. Sophie did. Dinner began at 7:30 in a private room overlooking the mountains. Claire's mother, Margaret Bennett, greeted Ethan warmly and Sophie even more warmly. Two cousins were polite. One uncle asked Ethan what he did before he had finished sitting down. Custom furniture, Ethan said. I manage a small shop in Asheville. Carpentry, the uncle asked, making the word sound smaller than it was. Mostly. Claire set down her water glass. Ethan builds things people keep for generations. Ethan looked at her. She had never seen his work. She only remembered how he had described it at the coffee shop. Something about that stayed with him. Halfway through dinner, Sophie accidentally tipped her water glass. It spilled across the white tablecloth and reached Claire's sleeve. The table went quiet with surprising speed. Claire simply moved the glass upright, handed Sophie a napkin, and said, "Good news. Water is the least expensive thing you could have spilled in this room." Sophie smiled with relief. Ethan watched Claire differently after that. Later, while the adults moved toward the lounge, Sophie persuaded Claire to walk with her to the lobby for hot chocolate. Ethan followed several steps behind. He watched Claire listen seriously while Sophie explained the correct marshmallow ratio. There was nothing polished about Claire then. No guarded smile. No careful answers. Just a woman walking beside his daughter. Near the elevators, a hotel manager approached with a folder. He stopped when he saw Ethan. Claire gave another tiny shake of her head. The manager turned away. Ethan caught it this time. "That is twice tonight." Claire looked at him. "What is?" People start walking toward you, then suddenly remember somewhere else they need to be. Before Claire could answer, Sophie returned with 3 cups and looked up at her. "Claire, can I ask you something?" "Anything." Sophie glanced around the enormous lobby, where employees seemed to notice Claire without openly watching her. "Why does everybody here look scared when you walk into a room?" Claire became very still. Across the lobby, Margaret Bennett had heard the question. She looked at her daughter, then at Ethan, and in that quiet moment Claire realized an 8-year-old girl was getting dangerously close to uncovering what Ethan still could not see. Claire looked down at the 3 cups of hot chocolate in Sophie's hands and chose her answer carefully. "Maybe I have one of those faces that makes people think they forgot something." Sophie considered this. "Dad has that face when I forget my homework." Ethan laughed, but his eyes stayed on Claire for a second longer than before. Margaret saved her daughter by asking Sophie whether she wanted to see the enormous stone fireplace in the West Lounge, and a moment passed. An hour later, Ethan found himself seated beside Claire at a long dinner table, while conversations moved around them in polished circles about investments, properties, and people whose names he did not recognize. Claire's uncle, Thomas, returned to Ethan's work with the persistence of someone trying to locate a man's value on a spreadsheet. "So, do you actually make furniture yourself?" "Every day. There cannot be much money in that anymore." Ethan cut a piece of roasted chicken and answered without looking offended. "Enough to raise my daughter." Thomas smiled. "That was not really what I meant." "I know." The table became quiet. Claire turned toward her uncle. "Ethan built a walnut dining table last month for a family whose grandparents planted the tree 60 years ago. They wanted something their grandchildren could inherit. I would say there is value in that." Ethan looked at her. Claire had remembered a story he had mentioned once, almost casually, in the coffee shop. Thomas changed the subject. After dinner, Ethan stepped onto the terrace where the mountain air had fallen into the low 50s. Claire joined him a minute later, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You did not have to defend me." "I know." She handed him one. "That is why I did." Below them, lights curved along the resort road. Ethan rested his forearms against the railing. "Your family asks a lot of questions. They believe information is control. And you?" Claire watched the lights. "I used to think control was safety." There was something in the answer that made Ethan stop joking. "What changed?" "I'm not sure anything did." She took a slow drink. "I just got tired." For the first time, she told him something real. Men had entered her life before with perfect manners and carefully rehearsed intentions. Some wanted access. Some wanted status. Some wanted whatever doors they believed she could open. Eventually, Claire had stopped wondering whether anyone actually saw her. Ethan did not ask what kind of door she meant. "Rachel used to say people tell you who they are when there is nothing to gain," he said. Claire looked at him. "Your wife?" He nodded. She was usually right. Annoyingly right. Claire smiled. "You still talk about her in the present tense sometimes." Ethan stared into his coffee. 4 years does not erase 12. Claire said nothing, and he was grateful for it. Through the glass doors, Sophie was helping Margaret arrange pieces on a chessboard. Her laughter carried faintly. Onto the terrace, Claire watched her. She is extraordinary. She is 8. Yesterday, she put a spoon in the microwave. Claire laughed softly. Then the silence returned, but it was different now. Comfortable. Ethan looked at her and said, "Maybe you should stop telling people what you have and see who stays when there's nothing to impress them." Claire's fingers tightened around the mug. The sentence landed too close to the truth. She had spent years wondering whether anyone could care about Claire without caring about Bennett. Now a man who did not know what Bennett meant was standing beside her, and she was beginning to care what he thought. Inside, Margaret appeared at the doorway. "Claire, may I borrow you?" Claire followed her into the quiet library. Margaret closed the door. He does not know. It was not a question. Claire looked toward the terrace. "I was going to tell him. When I knew this weekend was not just an arrangement." Margaret's expression softened, but not enough to excuse her. "That is exactly when it becomes harder." Claire said nothing. Margaret stepped closer. "Does Ethan know this resort belongs to your company?" "No." "Does he know you run Bennett Hospitality?" "No." Margaret glanced through the glass toward Ethan and Sophie. "Then you need to decide something before tomorrow morning." Claire already knew what she meant. At 9 o'clock, 14 executives would be waiting for her in a private conference wing. Margaret lowered her voice. "When exactly were you planning to tell him who you are?" Claire did not sleep much. At 7:15 Saturday morning, she stood near the restaurant entrance with her phone turned face down in her palm while Ethan and Sophie argued over whether blueberry pancakes counted as a balanced breakfast. "They have fruit," Sophie said. "That is a very creative interpretation of nutrition," Ethan replied. Claire smiled, but her attention kept drifting toward the clock above the fireplace. The emergency board meeting began at 9. She had told herself she would explain everything before then. At 7:20, at 7:40, at 8. Each time, Sophie said something that made the morning feel normal, and Claire postponed the truth by another few minutes. After breakfast, Ethan left to take a call from his shop. Sophie stayed with Claire beside a window overlooking the mountains, carefully building a tower from small packets of sugar. "Can I ask you something?" Sophie said. "You usually do. Do you eat dinner alone?" Claire looked at her. Of all the questions she had prepared herself to answer that weekend, this was not one of them. "Sometimes." Sophie added another packet. "Dad used to set 3 plates after Mom died." Claire said nothing. "Not every night. Just sometimes. He would get the 3rd plate from the cabinet and then stand there holding it." Sophie's voice remained matter-of-fact, which somehow made the words heavier. "Now he sets 2. Claire looked toward Ethan through the glass doors. He was outside with one hand in his jacket pocket, speaking quietly into his phone. "Your father loves you very much." "I know." Sophie adjusted the sugar tower. "But that is different." "Different from what?" Sophie shrugged. "Having somebody waiting for you." Claire glanced at her own phone. No messages. She had checked it 3 times in 5 minutes anyway. Sophie noticed. "Are you waiting for somebody?" Claire almost gave her usual answer. Instead, she said, "No. I think I'm used to nobody waiting for me." Sophie considered that with the seriousness only children could give to simple truths. Then she pushed one unopened sugar packet across the table. "You can have this one." Claire smiled. "Thank you. Is the good kind." Ethan returned and found Claire holding the packet as though Sophie had given her something valuable. Later that morning, the 3 walked a trail behind the resort. The path climbed less than a mile through red maples and white pines before opening onto a wooden overlook. Sophie ran ahead to read an information sign, while Ethan and Claire stayed behind. Ethan told Claire about Rachel without being asked. Rachel had loved fall. She had hated expensive coffee and loved terrible roadside diners. During her final year, she had made Ethan promise not to turn grief into a permanent address. "I've not done a great job keeping that promise," he said. Claire stopped beside the railing. "Maybe keeping it does not mean forgetting her." Ethan looked at Claire for a long moment. "You're different when nobody else is around." Her heart tightened. "Better or worse?" "More real." Claire looked away. "That sounds dangerous." "Why?" Ethan smiled slightly. "Because I think the real version is the one I like." Claire could have told him then. She should have. Instead, Ethan added quietly, "You know what I appreciate most about you?" Claire waited. "You do not pretend to be somebody you are not." The words erased her smile. Before she could answer, her phone vibrated. 8:52. Martin Caldwell. Claire declined the call. 8:54. Another vibration. She silenced it. Ethan noticed. "Everything okay?" "Yes." The lie came softly. Claire hated how easily it came. At 8:57, Sophie called from farther up the trail, and Ethan went to help her identify a bird. Claire's phone lit again. This time the message was impossible to ignore. 14 executives are seated. The board is waiting for you. Chief Executive Officer. Claire stared at the words. She had 3 minutes left, and Ethan was walking back toward her. At 8:58, Ethan reached Claire and saw the color had changed at her face. "You need to go somewhere." It was not a question. Claire locked her phone. "There's a work issue." "Then handle it." His answer was so simple that it made the truth harder to say. "Ethan, there is something I should have told you." Sophie came running toward them, holding a pine cone she had decided looked exactly like a tiny Christmas tree. Claire looked at the girl, then back at Ethan. Her phone vibrated again. 9 o'clock. "Go," Ethan said. "We will finish the trail." Claire hesitated, then walked quickly toward the resort. She told herself she would explain immediately after the meeting. It was one more delay in a weekend built from them. At 9:27, Ethan and Sophie returned through the east entrance. Sophie wanted another hot chocolate. Ethan wanted coffee and 10 quiet minutes to think about why Claire had looked frightened before leaving. Near the lobby, a temporary sign pointed guests away from the conference wing. Sophie stopped beside it. "The cafe was that way yesterday." "Other way, kiddo." They turned down the wrong corridor anyway. Ethan realized it after 50 yards, just as two men in suits passed them discussing quarterly occupancy numbers. At the end of the hall stood a pair of glass doors. Beyond them was a conference room large enough for 20 people. Ethan would have walked past without looking if he had not recognized Claire's voice. It was different, calm, precise, absolute. He stopped. Sophie stopped beside him. Through the glass, Claire stood at the head of a long walnut table. 14 executives sat facing her. Martin Caldwell was among them. So was the resort manager who had avoided Claire the night before. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody looked away. Behind Claire, a presentation filled an enormous screen. Ethan read the words once. Then again. Bennett Hospitality Group. Emergency Board Session. Beneath that, in smaller letters, was the line that changed the entire weekend. Claire Bennett, Chief Executive Officer. Sophie looked up at him. "Dad." Ethan said nothing. Suddenly, every strange moment rearranged itself. The employees straightening when Claire entered. The manager approaching with a folder. Martin asking whether Ethan knew who he was with. The private suite. The careful answers. Hospitality is a small world. Claire turned toward the glass. She saw him. For the first time that morning, her voice stopped. 14 people followed her gaze. Ethan did not look impressed. That hurt more than anger would have. He looked disappointed. Claire closed the folder in front of her. "We will recess for 15 minutes. No one questioned her. She crossed the room and opened the glass door. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Ethan, Chief Executive Officer? His voice was quiet. "I was going to tell you. When..." Claire looked at Sophie and lowered her voice. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Ethan asked Margaret, who had just appeared from the lobby, to stay with Sophie for a few minutes. Sophie hesitated before taking Margaret's hand. Claire led Ethan onto an empty terrace overlooking the mountains. "Bennett Hospitality owns this resort," she said, "and 17 others. I became Chief Executive Officer 6 years ago." Ethan absorbed the information without changing expression. "Are you a millionaire?" Claire paused. That pause answered him. Ethan looked toward the mountains. "I do not care about your money." "I know. No, Clyde. You do. Not." He turned toward her. "If you did, you would understand why this is not about what you own. I was afraid you would treat me differently. So you decided I did not deserve the truth. That is not what I meant. We made 4 rules." Claire's eyes lowered. Ethan continued, still calm. "The last one was yours to refuse." "I know. You agreed anyway." Claire stepped closer, but Ethan moved back just enough for her to notice. "I like the woman drinking hot chocolate with my daughter," he said. I like the woman who sat outside with me last night. I was starting to believe she trusted me. She does. Ethan shook his head. Then why did she test me? Claire had no answer. Inside the conference room, 14 executives were waiting for their chief executive officer to return. On the terrace, for perhaps the first time in years, Claire Bennett had all the authority in the building and none of the power that mattered. Claire returned to the conference room at 9:43. No one asked where she had been. They only watched her take the chair at the head of the table and open the financial report as if nothing had happened. But something had. For 6 years, Claire had made decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars without allowing emotion to enter the room. Now one quiet sentence followed her through every page. Then why did she test me? The emergency was worse than she had expected. Bennett Hospitality had planned to sell 3 older properties after a difficult quarter, and Richard Bennett had arrived with a proposal to make the numbers cleaner before the sale. 612 employees would be eliminated. Their positions would be outsourced. The savings would satisfy investors before Monday. It is unpleasant, Richard said, but necessary. Claire looked at the spreadsheet. Yesterday, she might have studied margins first. Today she saw names. Housekeepers, maintenance workers, cooks, front desk employees, people who probably drove old trucks, packed lunches, raised children, and never entered rooms like this one. Find another way, she said. Richard leaned back. There is no other way that protects the quarter. I did not ask you to protect the quarter. I asked you to protect the company. At 10:12, Ethan carried their bags through the lobby while Sophie walked beside him, unusually quiet. Margaret had offered to arrange transportation. Ethan declined. When a valet brought his Ford around, Sophie looked back toward the resort. Is Claire coming? No, squeaked. Because she lied? Ethan placed the bags in the truck bed. Because sometimes adults need time to figure out what trust means after they damage it. Sophie climbed into the passenger seat. Do you still like her? Ethan closed the door gently. Children had an unfair talent for finding the question adults avoided. He drove home without answering. Back at the resort, Richard pushed a second document toward Claire. There is another option. Sell the Asheville maintenance. Contracts, close the regional workshops, and reduce payroll by 30%. Claire read the proposal. One contractor name caught her attention. Walker Custom Woodworks. Ethan's shop supplied restoration work to 2 Bennett properties through a subcontractor. Richard noticed where she was looking. Actually, that gives us leverage. Keep his contract. Expand it. He will calm down. Claire slowly lifted her eyes. You think I should buy his forgiveness? I think people become reasonable when the number is large enough. Claire closed the folder. Then you understand him even less than I did. She removed Ethan's company from the discussion entirely. No special contract. No favor. No punishment. His livelihood would not become a tool in her personal life. For the next 3 hours, Claire rebuilt the proposal with the finance team. Executive bonuses were deferred. 2 expansion projects were postponed. A planned renovation of the corporate headquarters was canceled. The older properties would remain open for 90 days while management developed a restructuring plan that protected hourly employees first. The decision would cost the company millions in short-term savings. At 1:26, Martin Caldwell studied the revised numbers. The board will challenge this. Then they can challenge me. Investors may not like it. Claire signed the authorization. Employees are not disposable because a spreadsheet becomes uncomfortable. By Monday morning, word of the decision had traveled through Bennett Hospitality faster than Claire expected. By Tuesday afternoon, it reached a supplier who occasionally worked with Ethan's shop. Ethan was sanding the edge of a maple cabinet when his foreman mentioned that Bennett Hospitality had stopped more than 600 layoffs. Ethan's hand became still. Who stopped it? The chief executive officer, apparently, overruled her own board. Ethan looked down at the unfinished cabinet. Claire had not called him since Saturday. She had not sent flowers, money, an expensive gift, or a contract. She had done exactly what he had asked without realizing he had asked it. She had made a choice when there was nothing to gain from him. That evening, Ethan found Sophie at the kitchen table drawing 3 people beneath a row of mountain trees. He recognized himself. He recognized Sophie. He did not ask who the third person was. At 7:18, someone knocked on the front door. Ethan opened it. Claire stood alone on the porch in jeans and the same cream sweater she had worn the morning they met. There was no assistant behind her, no luxury car waiting at the curb, and nothing in her hands. "I'm not here to ask you to forgive me," she said. "I came because I owe you the truth, even if the truth changes nothing." Ethan stood in the doorway for several seconds before stepping aside. "Sophie is finishing homework." Claire nodded. "I will not stay long." She entered the small house without looking around, as though comparing it to anything she owned. Sophie appeared from the kitchen with a pencil behind one ear. Her face brightened, then became serious when she remembered she was supposed to be disappointed. Claire crouched so they were closer to eye level. "Before I talk to your dad, I owe you an apology." Sophie looked at Ethan, then back at Claire. "For being a chief executive officer?" "No, for letting you believe I had told you everything important about myself when I had not." Sophie thought about that. "Dad says saying sorry only works if you know what you were sorry for." Claire glanced at Ethan. "Your dad is right. He usually thinks so." Ethan almost smiled. Claire continued. "I was afraid people would treat me differently if they knew how much money I had or what job I did. Instead of trusting you and your father to make your own choice, I made it for you. That was unfair." Sophie accepted this with a small nod, then disappeared into the kitchen. Ethan remained near the doorway. "You did not have to apologize to her first." "Yes, I did. She was part of the weekend." Claire sat at the edge of the couch, but did not make herself comfortable. "There is something else you should know. Richard suggested using your company's contracts to fix this." Ethan's expression changed. "What does that mean?" "Your shop has done subcontracted restoration work for 2 Bennett properties. He suggested expanding those contracts. And you, I removed your company from the discussion. No reward, no punishment. Your work should stand on its own." Ethan studied her carefully. "Why tell me?" "Because last weekend I decided what you were allowed to know. I'm not doing that again." The room became quiet. Claire told him the rest without protecting herself. She told him about men who had pursued introductions instead of relationships, about friendships that changed after business favors were refused, and about how easily suspicion had become habit. "None of that excuses what I did," she said. "It only explains why I became someone who tests people before trusting them." Ethan leaned against the kitchen doorway. "And what happens when they fail your test?" "I leave first. And when they pass?" Claire looked down. "Apparently, I find another reason not to trust them." That answer was honest enough to hurt. Sophie returned carrying something behind her back. It was a small wooden chair, unfinished maple, sized for a child. One leg had a visible repair where the grain changed slightly. She placed it in front of Claire. "Dad was going to throw this part away." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That is not exactly what happened." Sophie ignored him. "It cracked while we were making it. I wanted to keep it." Claire ran her fingers over the repaired wood. "You can barely see where it broke. Dad says broken does not mean useless." Ethan looked toward the floor. Claire swallowed before answering. "Your dad sounds annoyingly right, too." Sophie smiled. When Claire stood to leave, Ethan walked her to the porch. The October air had turned cold, and somewhere down the street a dog barked once before the neighborhood became quiet again. "I heard about the employees," Ethan said. Claire stopped. "The 612 jobs. That was business." "Was it?" "It was the right decision, even though it cost you." Claire looked back through the window, where Sophie was carrying the little chair toward the kitchen. "Maybe I'm learning that cost and value are not the same thing." Ethan let that sit between them. Claire stepped off the porch. "I meant what I said. I'm not asking you for anything." "Claire." She turned. "I'm still angry. You should be. And I still do not trust you the way I did Friday." Her face tightened, but she nodded. Ethan continued. "But I believe the woman standing on this porch is finally telling me the truth." Claire did not smile immediately. When she did, it was small and tired and real. "That is enough for tonight." She walked toward a rental car. Ethan watched until she reached it. Then Sophie appeared beside him wrapped in a blanket. "Is she coming back?" Ethan looked at the empty little chair through the kitchen window, then at Claire's taillights disappearing around the corner. "I do not know." Sophie leaned against his arm. "I think she should." Ethan said nothing, because for the first time since the resort, part of him thought so too. 3 months later, Claire Bennett arrived at Ethan Walker's house at 8:12 on a Saturday morning, carrying nothing more expensive than a paper bag of blueberries. There was no assistant waiting at the curb, no driver checking a schedule, and no reason for anyone in the neighborhood to know that the woman walking up Ethan's porch steps had spent Friday approving a $48 million hotel renovation. Sophie opened the door before Claire could knock. "You were late." Claire checked her watch. "By 12 minutes. Dad notices minutes." From the kitchen, Ethan called, "Your pancakes are getting cold, Sophie." Claire followed the smell of coffee into the kitchen and stopped. 3 plates sat on the table. 3 mugs. 3 chairs. The small repaired maple chair Sophie had shown her months earlier now stood beside the window, finished with a warm coat of honey-colored oil. Nothing about the room was expensive. Claire had gradually learned that almost everything in it mattered. Trust had returned the same way Ethan built furniture, slowly, without hiding the joints. Claire never asked him to forget the weekend at Bennett Ridge. Ethan never demanded that she become less successful to make him comfortable. She still ran Bennett Hospitality. He still opened his woodworking shop before 7 most mornings. Some weeks they saw each other twice. Some weeks only once. Claire attended Sophie's school science night and spent 40 minutes listening to an explanation about bird migration. Ethan attended a Bennett charity dinner and quietly escaped to the kitchen when 3 executives tried to discuss investments with him. Claire found him there helping a dishwasher repair a loose cabinet hinge. She had laughed for nearly a minute. More importantly, Claire stopped testing him. If she was afraid, she said so. If work interrupted dinner, she explained why. When Ethan needed space, she gave it without turning silence into punishment. Even Richard eventually stopped referring to Ethan as a complication after Claire made one boundary unmistakable. Her personal life was not a corporate asset. The 612 jobs saved that October remained intact through the restructuring, and Bennett Hospitality ended the following quarter stronger than the board had predicted. Ethan heard about it from other people, never from Claire. That mattered to him. On this Saturday morning, Sophie placed a pancake on Claire's plate and arranged blueberries into a crooked smile. "Perfect," Claire said. "It has one eye bigger than the other. That is personality." Ethan poured coffee and looked at Claire across the table. For years earlier, after Rachel died, mornings had become something he survived through routine. Pack the lunch. Find a missing shoe. Get Sophie to school. Keep moving. He had once believed healing meant returning to the person he had been before loss. Claire had taught him something different without ever trying to teach it. Sometimes healing meant becoming someone new without betraying who had been lost. Claire seemed to understand that Rachel's place in their story did not have to disappear for another chapter to begin. After breakfast, Sophie carried the plates to the sink. Ethan reached into his pocket and placed 2 folded pieces of paper on the table. Claire looked down. "What are those?" "Tickets." "To what?" "Blue Ridge Fall Festival. Apple cider, live music, probably overpriced pie." Claire looked at him suspiciously. "This sounds dangerously normal." "That is the idea." Ethan took a sip of coffee. "I need a date for the weekend." Claire's expression softened. "Real or fake?" Sophie became completely still at the sink, obviously listening. Ethan looked at Claire, allowing the silence to hold for 1 second longer than necessary. "I thought we could try real this time." Claire smiled, not the controlled smile she used in boardrooms and not the careful one she had worn during that first weekend. "Just hers." "I would like that." Sophie turned around. "Good, because I already packed snacks." Ethan shook his head. "Of course you did." An hour later, the 3 of them walked out through the front door together. Claire's phone remained inside her purse. Ethan carried a thermos. Sophie hurried ahead toward the truck, announcing that she controlled the music. Claire stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked back at the little house. Once, she had believed wealth meant never needing anything from anyone. Ethan had believed surviving loss meant never risking enough to lose again. Both had been wrong. Ethan held out his hand. Claire took it. Then they followed Sophie toward the old Ford waiting at the curb, not toward an empire, a boardroom, or anything money could measure, but toward an ordinary Saturday that none of them needed to pretend was anything else.